All right. So welcome to Friday. If you've not been welcomed already. We are going to get started with our board governance meeting. I emailed an agenda, so it should be in members' email boxes. And that agenda is also, well, I know we already have one update to that information because the dates seem to be moving, but in that agenda is also just some background information. I thought it might be helpful to kind of reground us in the questions that we wanted to ask as this committee, but also take some time to share some like starter questions that we could use for the fall engagement. Now, I will say that these are all things we can kind of like spaghetti, throw up against the wall and see what sticks. It's not gonna hurt anybody to rip them apart, spin them around, flip them over, whatever. And so that is largely how I'm expecting us to spend our time today. I want to ask, is there anything else that's not on the agenda that makes sense for us to cover today? Yes.
I don't know if this needs to be on the agenda, but it was just a question I had about, I looked back at the work plan, which I hadn't done admittedly for a while. And I was noticing that we were going to have some draft recommendations, you know, that were kind of behind on that, which maybe isn't a terrible thing, but I just wanted to, I was also thinking, you know, we've heard from the AU folks, we have that crosswalk, we heard from the Mathematica guy, like, do we want to compile just like what the takeaways are from that and see if there are recommendations, not necessarily that are ready to even share with the board yet, but that are like the beginning of that process? Just seems like we haven't tied the knot on that, or like we haven't really reflected on what we learned and synthesized it. So that was just something I was thinking we may want to do, not instead of moving forward with the engagement, but just in addition to.
Okay. So do we want to add that as an agenda item? Is that what you're suggesting?
I guess, I mean, I think it may be something we need to discuss at the next meeting, because I think what you've given us is, you know, enough to fill the hour for sure. I just, you know, maybe it's also something we do between now and the next meeting. Maybe we ask staff to do it, which is just to compile or like to reflect on what we've learned. So yeah, what do you guys think? What should we do? Or should we just leave it as it is?
I mean, I like the idea of doing that at some point between now and when we do engagement, but I wouldn't take time today.
Okay.
Which
yeah.
I think is consistent with because I have some questions. I mean, I agree on that. We didn't really talk through the crosswalks, and I definitely have some questions on that. So
yeah, so maybe we can think about a way, and again, you know, not in this meeting, but maybe through email or something, just how to do a little reflecting and pull out the high level takeaways between now and the next meeting. Yay, Jacques. But that's it. Okay, I think we can move on.
Okay. So let's hello, represent. Is that a Seahawks shirt I see? We're going hometown
from
with it.
Seattle. Yes, I am.
You're from Seattle?
Yes, I am.
I didn't know that.
Born and
Half
raised.
of my family lives there.
Born and raised. So yes, I do support Seattle's at times. They lost last night.
Well,
Sorry.
that's the indication of a true fan.
Mhm.
Is when it's not just about I'm gonna support myself when they win. So I respect the loyalty, sir. Definitely. All right. So Emily, just to respond, I think so. I think two things. One is one of the things we probably need to think about as a committee. I know that in our board reports, I've shared the crosswalk a few times. I'm not so sure if people have opinions or find a document helpful. I think it's helpful. I do think we should probably think about, are there ways to just bring our colleagues along on this educational journey we're having? So that's my first thought. My second thought is we did not, the way the work plan is designed, and yes, we are behind. We'll probably also make a request for this committee to be extended beyond December, because I think what we undertook was a bit ambitious, but the way it was designed was that we would do engagement before we make recommendations, because that engagement will inform our recommendations. That does not mean that what you're saying doesn't have value as a checkpoint as far as our learning and understanding journey.
Right.
So I see those things as complementary.
Agreed.
And to Representative Wattenberg's point, we have a bunch of stuff going on this hour, and we probably want to give the appropriate time and attention to think through what you're describing. So if it's okay, we should, I think, start that conversation offline around how to better do that with our colleagues, and delve a little bit deeper into what does engagement with the public look like, if that's okay with everyone. And so Representative Patterson, I was saying that this morning I sent an agenda. I shared a few of the questions guiding questions that we decided on as a committee that we wanted to answer. And that's just from notes from like one of those early meetings we had. I think of this, public engagement piece of it is starting to answer the guiding questions that are, I think that's 3 and 4. And so I tried my hand at putting my focus group hat on and saying, like, what are some of the questions we could start to answer as just a place for people to respond to. Now, I also share with the other members that there's no pride of authorship here. I'm really thinking about this as like, if you're cooking spaghetti, throw the noodles up against the wall. It's not gonna hurt anybody. You'll know when it's done if it sticks. So if these things don't stick and we need to flip them around and move them around, or throw up something else, that's fine too. But I thought it might be helpful, and I believe I committed to some bones for us to start to generate questions. And so I think that's what we would use the bulk of our time for today. I want to share that. So we have 3 agenda points just for people who, if anyone's listening. John Paul was kind enough to float some dates that he's trying to figure out for the fall engagement sessions that'll serve a few committees. Initially, they were looking at the end of October. It looks like we're going to be in November. So no solid dates yet, but likely November. The public engagement questions, and I'm happy to, if it's helpful, to read the guiding questions we have just to ground us again, and then just taking some time to think about other types of engagement. I noted survey suggestion as an example, but I know that Representative Wattenberg also has some recommendations about going out to meetings and those types of things. So that's the bones of how we'll spend our time today. If it's okay, I just I'll give people a moment to look at the email I sent, and we'll just welcome any thoughts around, if we feel like the right direction, not necessarily if they're good, bad, or whatever, but like if these feel like the right direction for the types of questions, and then just, open up for discussion.
Can I just clarify? So you are thinking of this particular set of questions as like a focus group, or like this would be maybe a focus group during the fall engagement sessions, for instance,
Yeah.
right?
So what what I took from our notes and I committed to at our last meeting was starting to say, okay, what kinds of questions will we be asking people?
Yeah.
For me, the starting point for that was our guiding questions as a committee.
Yeah,
and what
no,
we
I like
wanted
that.
to learn.
Mhm.
And so I then said, okay, what are the types of questions that I think would start to unearth some of those things? Recognizing that what I do is not necessarily this type of science, but I, I wanted us to take a stab so we have some opportunity to respond to. So that's the expectation, is that like these are the types of questions that we think we could get input from the public around understanding how they're experiencing governance, understanding where challenges are, any pain points, and then some things around like what people want to see moving forward. Because those were the things that we said would be helpful to hear from, the people who this affects. You want to create solutions for real problems. So
That makes sense.
does that make sense?
Yeah. I have some thoughts. I did get a chance to look at it beforehand. So one thought I had was, I mean, I think the set of 3 sections are great if we, like for a focus group, if you have a full hour, 45 minutes with folks. One thought I had was the questions for understanding experiences are the kinds of questions that everybody can answer, with their own experience. I feel like it should go first. It's really generative, and it would be almost like a warm up. I mean, it's not a warm up, but what I mean is it gets people talking, So that is just a format thing. I was thinking, it's like it's a no fail question, basically, right? And then similarly, in the first and second section, the last question, like the last bullet, for instance, under understanding perception, you had what words come to mind when you think of governance and decision making. I was thinking, again, it would be good to start with that bullet point in that section for the same reason, sort of like, well, for that reason, because it's generative and it's, a no fail question, but also because I think it's a good reflection question before you answer these others. Like it would help me if I reflected on that and then I answered the question of like, what words or feelings come to mind when you think about governance? That's a similar kind of one, but how well do you feel we incorporate feedback from you? Once I've sort of thought about, what I feel already or what, I'm thinking about, I think that would be a good, like I've created a context. And then just one more thing, this is kind of like an editing thing, I guess, is starting in bullet 3 in that section, understanding perception, but consistent throughout, you use our. And I guess I would think this means like the state board, but I think what we want to say is education decision makers, or right? Is that who we're talking about? Or do you know what I mean? So it says in the third bullet point, how well do we feel we incorporate feedback? Do we mean how well do you feel that education decision makers in our city incorporate feedback?
So I will acknowledge 2 things about myself. One is that when I care about something, I'm possessive. And so I'm very much like we and our, like I tend to, you'll hear me default to like our kids. And it's just like, oh, collective. Instead of like, oh, well, those are Woodson's kids, or those are, Sue's kids, or, like I tend to default to our. I also tend to default to we when talking about things that are public goods, I guess, because, and maybe this is just a more privileged perspective, but I assume ownership. Like I assume that certain things are are a we, like we should have power over our schools, or we should have input. And so I don't necessarily think of this as like the state board versus the mayor's office or the DME. I think of this as more like DC, the community, like yeah.
So I appreciate
Yeah.
that view. And I think it would be useful, especially in a few, not in all of them, but in some of them, to clarify, because I do think part of what we're trying to get to is on these particular areas where we or others have responsibility, are they getting, is their feedback being listened to? But, and I'm, in a way that was interrupting, because when Emily's finished, or Jacques, I have a point that speaks to this a little bit.
No, I mean, sorry, I don't think of it as interrupting.
Let's go.
I think of this as more like conversation based. I also want to say that I think this language is imperfect. I also think it's a little too. I actually don't think this language is super accessible. And so I would also and I want to hear initial reactions, but I also would welcome some feedback. Like I would like to replace governance in some instances with other things. So like I don't know if some of it is around communication. I don't know if some of it is around engagement. I don't know if there are other decision making. I don't. And maybe it's a follow-up question and design type of thing. But I don't think I started to write this, but I don't as a guidepost, but I don't think this is like, yes, I would present this to any and every group, if that makes sense. Like, I don't think of these as particularly accessible.
So on my main point is actually on the word governance and everything related to that. And to your point, how to make this speak to people. So these are just my notes, also not in order, but who do people think is responsible for running the show here? I mean, do they know it's the mayor? Do they think it's the chancellor? Do they think who do they think it is? And what do they think those people do? I mean, I think it would be really interesting to understand that, what the perceptions are, kind of specifically, who do who decides, I'm trying to think, I mean, of course, who decides COVID policy, because we're all talking about that now, but who decides, where the money gets spent? What are the priorities? Who makes decisions? And we could even have sort of a set of questions. Who do you think makes the decisions on blah, blah, blah? Just to get a sense of that. Mm-hmm. And then, like, where do schools get located? Who decides that? Who decides to get rid of your principal? I mean, you could come up with a bunch of them, but anyway. And then,
can I ask a question? Do you see that as more for conversation or captured better in something like a survey? So we have a baseline understanding of where people are.
I would think both. If we're going to do both, I think it's a good question. Like, I could totally imagine in a focus group hearing from folks what they think, but it could also could even be a drop down,
But I could see something like that if you did a poll during a focus group, just to see I can't see something like that for discussion, because I don't.
Why not?
When I play it out in my head, I'm just gonna be honest. When I play it out in my head, if I ask people all those things and they say all this stuff, and then they start to you try to moderate that, people go down a rabbit hole that I don't know if I really want them to go down. I do think understanding the baseline of how people think about this is important. And so capturing it and a lot of these people are going to be wrong. And so I also try not to embarrass people. And so,
I mean, that's true. But
I think what the information you're trying to unearth is valuable. I do question where you ask it and how you ask it. Like, is it a discussion question, or is it like a poll or survey or something where you can like where it can inform discussion?
That's fine. I just think, to your point, I think that, how would you describe our governance? That's way too academic, and I don't think anyone knows what we most, so that I was just trying to replace that with, who do you think runs things? That was more my purpose,
Okay.
just to get a sense of that, and then maybe give specific issues. But I agree with you. The point is not to, you don't want to show that people don't know. That can be embarrassing. I think you'd get more of in a discussion, at least my experience doing this is, people are like, really? It's not like anybody feels dumb. It's more like, oh, really? I never thought about that. Is that right? Do they, who's that? Anyway, that's one thought on it. And then the other piece is where you go to this, but I know you get to this at some point, but this idea of, where do you go when you have a concern? Like, if you think that, and I know we don't want to be leading, but to me, part of what I think about is, if I lived somewhere else and there was some issue, the heating's not fixed, the COVID doesn't work, my school lost its AP courses, or the school down the street has better I would go to the school board. That is what I would do. I would go to a school board meeting and I'd say my piece, and maybe people would ignore me and maybe they wouldn't. And the way these things tend to work is, if you raise something and it's serious, other people chime in, and you don't get everything, but it gets on the agenda typically. How do people do that? Where do they go to raise these issues? I wonder if people see it as I just like to know how, or do they just say, yeah, there's no place to go? I don't know.
Can I just jump into and say, I guess I would push back a little on the thought that it would be like going down a rabbit hole. My thinking on it was really just that it would fit squarely in the gathering perceptions category. Like, it's not about right or wrong. It really is just about hearing. I think it's important to know where people are starting from, to inform what kind of recommendations we would make. But also, this was another question I had, was, do we want to do some preliminary, like, baseline? I don't want to call it education, but just like, for instance, I often in classes I teach, I show a, what do you call it? Like a organizational chart of DC agency connections, right? So you have the mayor, who then appoints these, and so people at least have a visual of and a grasp on how many agencies there are. DC is particularly convoluted. Like, we have a lot. So I wonder how much of that we would want to do. Like Ruth mentioned, we don't want to be leading, but at the same time, it's good to have a baseline that everybody is starting from.
And can I ask a question? I apologize if I missed this. What do you want to come out of the governance committee? Is it recommendations that we're going to give to someone in how we're going to change the governance, or is it an education of what we do and how our system works? So I'm trying to figure out, because to me that dictates all the questions that we're going to do. That comes after that. If we're educating folks on what we do, where accountability and responsibility and decision making, that's one thing. If we're doing recommendations on how we think the system should work, that's another thing. So that's why I kind of go back to that question. And I apologize again if I missed that. But what would you like to see come out of the governance committee?
Yeah, I think those are good questions, and definitely no apology needed. the way I think about what our task is really us getting a better understanding of how people experience governance, and depending on what we hear from people, is making a recommendation to say, here's what would improve, whether it's people's experiences, or here's what would take us to our vision for where education should move to. I don't necessarily think of the task of our committee as what like the student advocate does, or the ombudsman does. I know that actually last night, but also just over the years, like both Dan and Faith, I've worked with them to do to provide things like that in our community, because people are really at a disadvantage for understanding how to access our system. But I don't necessarily think of the work of that as a primary goal of this committee. I do think that we can direct people to those resources. There might be opportunities along the way that we identify with our sister offices to say, hey, we're realizing that, part of the barrier for this conversation, and maybe that is in our recommendation, is that people just need more, in order to be able to interact and give real feedback, they need more education around how things actually work. I know last night listening in, I heard people talk about family engagement, and there was a little bit of back and forth around family engagement. And I'm like, family engagement is not governance. They're important. They're all important for how people access schools, but those are actually two separate components. I'm thinking about, and I guess we'll talk about at some point the legislation that's in front of the council. I'm not so sure. One of the things I worry about is if that's actually grounded in people's experience. I think a lot of the aggravation we've heard or challenges we've heard actually are a different set of responsibilities. And we have people showing up and saying like, oh, this is ending mayoral control, and it's actually not, right? And so I do have a concern, and I'm not, I am aware of, I have very strong peripheral vision, right? Around people being able to access some of these conversations in a way where just because they don't completely understand our very complicated structure. That being said, I also am a firm believer that people actually do understand their own experience. And so we don't have to wait or do a bunch of education around who does what, to hear from people like, all right, here's what's happening, good, bad, or ugly for me.
And that's my point, really, because I wanted, and I appreciate that explanation, because that helps me understand how to approach this, being a member on this committee. Because I think it is very much to what you say and falls within our realm on the state board and where we sit currently, is to find out what is your experience with education and how decisions are made. We need to know that. I see it very much in the same way that doing my day job, which I'm in right now, how KIP reaches out to parents and basically say, okay, what has been your experience with KIP in this area, in that area, in that area? And then we use those to kind of like change different things or make recommendations or whatever the case may be, what we decide to do with that information. But I do see that as, okay, so what has been your experience right now under this kind of like this current structure? Have you been confused about where to go? Do you not know where to go? Do you know who's, in a sense, like Emily said, it's an educational aspect. Do you know who to go to or who makes what decision about certain things? That's kind of how I kind of perceive what you're saying and everything like that. And that's like what I'd like to see the questions kind of get to is, what has people's experience been? We've been under mayoral control for quite some time now. What has been your experience with education currently in trying to get problems resolved? Because we sit on the state board. What has that experience been like? And then the questions kind of coming from that and saying, if you had a problem here, how did you resolve that problem? Because we do have a student advocate. We do have an ombudsman that falls within OSSE. I don't know how much this committee wants to get into the actual where we sit and all that stuff that's going on right now. But I do know that people have experiences just like you said, and they feel very passionate about that experience when they're trying to resolve an issue that deals with their children and their quality of education. And we want to know what that's like so that we can help that to be better.
You're making me think about, like, first of all, I just want to say I completely agree about grounding most of this in constituents' experience. I think that's where we're going to get the most. But it is also making me think that maybe we can craft our questions to also reflect what mayoral control was supposed to achieve. And I think that we did get some of that from the first student report. I have to go back and look at it. But what was, looking at para, what was supposed to be improved, right? And if we can ask questions about people's experience based on, what should be happening, like what should be better, and then getting their input on that, I think that could be very informative for us to then see how does that then,
I actually agree a
line
lot
up.
with that, Emily, because like we've been, like I said, we've been in this since 2007, since para was invented, and we want to know, okay, is it working or is it not working? I think a lot of times we do a policy and we don't look at the evaluation of that policy after it's been implemented. We just kind of, it's there and we hear complaints about it, or people don't really understand what that implementation meant. So I actually agree a lot there, Emily, in trying to find that out. And then we also find out what it did do right. It did make sure that there was a person that you could hold accountable for, if books weren't put out, if the budget wasn't a certain way, that is the mayor. The buck stops with the mayor under mayoral control. And some of those things where they were dispersed, because I was actually here, as we've gone through different iterations with the school board and who had control. I've been here through the good times and the bad times, and raised children in the good times and the bad times. So we do want to find out how that works, what's working and what's not working. So I agree with that.
So the other thing I just want to throw out is I worry a little about overly starting as blank slates. I mean, the reality is hundreds of people have come to talk to us in testimony since the spring, largely about COVID, not entirely, but we've heard just an enormous amount about the different ways in which people aren't able to get their views heard. That's why they're coming to us. And I wonder if part of this, if we even might premise it that way, to sort of say, there was this move to mayoral control, and it may or may not have accomplished whatever, maybe say the goals, and people have different views, or however you start it, and then say, we have been hearing a lot in the, about people's difficulties getting things accomplished. And we're here to find out whether you feel that. Are there issues that you are getting through on that we're not aware of? Do we only just hear about the complainers? Are there issues that you haven't been able to get attention to that haven't come to our attention? In other words, to sort of put out, look, this is sort of what we've been hearing. Help me figure out if it reflects
And
you.
so what I would say, Ruth, and if I may interject, what I would say, that's the difference between what council does and what we do on the State Board of Education. I think they have an ability to change structure, like they're doing, like some proposals are coming up right now. And we, at the current time, don't have that authority. Now, if we find out how people are feeling and they want something different, and we say, this is how people are feeling, this has been their experience, and we channel that up to the people who actually can make that decision, that's one thing. But if we start out saying, we've been hearing from you, that almost says as if we're going to respond to their desire to have something different, or it's been bad. We know most people are going to come to you and it's going to be bad. Then what do we do with that information? I guess is what I'm getting to, because it's going to come back, and it's going to come back mostly, we can pretty much guesstimate, pretty much percentage bad. That, I had a bad experience, because those are most of the people that will respond. And then what do you do with it? How do you tell those people, this is what I'm going to do with it? Or do you use it to say, this is what we need to do as far as a structural change in governance? Because whatever information you get, you also have to respond with and use it. It's not just something for an exercise. You have to actually use it. So then what do you do with it?
Well, I hope we,
No, I was can I with that, and actually John Paul I think was, maybe he was in my head and he could like see via Zoom. I don't know what was happening. But John Paul put in the chat, we can use a meeting and hearing for some of the summaries work. Like it's an opportunity to say to people, what are you experiencing? But there's a bit of caution that I actually would agree with around inferences and inferring, because we largely, like, yes, there have been some groups who have advocacy positions who have showed up and talked about governance, mayoral control, however you want to categorize it. I actually, at least in my short time on the board, have not seen a large groundswell of testimonies around change the governance structure. Now, I agree with you that there are things that make me go, to me, I think of that as symptoms of our complicated, non-responsive governance. Like but I don't know if I feel necessarily comfortable given that's not how they identified their own issue, drawing that inference. And I would say that I don't think of what we're like, because we are the conveners, because we are the designers, there really is no blank slate here. I do think of it as putting people, or my goal would be to put people on equal footing, because I tend to see a bunch of value in conversations that expand beyond the people who aren't talking about this every day. And I don't want it to be that people who are savvy enough, people who are privileged enough, people who are connected to certain groups are where we start our form the bones of what I want to give other people the opportunity to weigh in before I say, here's our frame. Because those people's input are super valuable too. And so I feel, in summary, I feel a little uncomfortable, even though I can see the parallels you're talking about in drawing that inference, because that's not how people described their concern as. And I want to think about going into these engagements as, again, like an opportunity not to start from a blank slate, but how do we put people on equal footing in engaging with this issue? I will also, just housekeeping wise, because a bunch of us have day jobs, say it is 1:45. And like, I took some notes. I think it probably would be helpful. And if you're like me, you probably also need, like, you probably have some initial reactions. And then there are probably things that you're like, oh, it would be helpful if I could step away from this and send some thoughts. But I want to do like a last call for any feedback around questions, and then invite us to move that to like email, some outside of committee discussion, just to leave time for us to talk about other types of engagement that makes sense. So last call. And if people are okay with the last call, and or is there, and does that make sense to talk about those things next?
yeah, the only thing I'd add, which I think I have sort of said, is just where do you go when you have a concern about X? As just what do people do? It's another way to go at it. Okay.
I wrote that down.
Okay. That's it for me.
Okay, thank you all. All right, so let's use our last 13 minutes so nobody gets tired, including me, for talking about other types of engagement that make sense. So I know that at our, I guess that was our working session, and I should be able to just be like, at our working session, but clearly my mind is gone. I think that was Representative Parker who was like, oh, well, are you all going to do some type of survey and or, you know, poll, or is it that we want to identify meetings we want to go to, since that's something we've talked about. But I want to make sure that we do have some benchmarks, some more benchmarks, and think about like, all right, what for us, what does full engagement look like? And that way we're not just like, oh, and we should do this and we should do that and we should, because that is exhausting and unsustainable. So thoughts?
Yeah, I do think if we want our feedback input to be more representative, to your point earlier about, not just wanting to attract the folks who would come anyway. We need to be proactive about identifying maybe groups that meet about, like I would say in Ward 1, we have a kindred group, and their focus is much more on like creating networks within their schools. It's not so much policy facing. They would probably not come to it, they wouldn't necessarily respond to an invitation for a focus group, but I could go to that meeting, I could request, and what I would say then related to the questions is I would want to have a much shorter, list of questions. So I think our task is to identify like different sets of questions for different kinds of engagement, if that makes sense.
So my question, and I know we're sort of talking in circles, and partly it's because we're trying to figure this out. So I get that. But it does get back to what are we engaging for? In other words, who I want to engage and what I want to ask in this context depends on what we as a board are trying to do. Now, and here's what's a little complicated, and I think it's complicated in all the committees. I think it's complicated in our STAR committee. We all engage to some extent in different ways. And some of us have been here longer and shorter. So when I think of this issue, I talk to people about this issue all the time. And I use it to sort of have, views as these things come up at different points, right? And how is this? I guess to me, it's sort of like, what am I using? Is there a particular reason for this particular engagement that's doing something different? I'm sorry, that is so inarticulate, but that I'm sort of trying to grasp how this is different from what we each do individually. Or is it a way to help each of us to do more individually? That's, I guess, part of what I'm not sure of. And
so fortunately, at least at the governance committee, I don't know about some of the other committees, we don't have articulation requirements. I will say that, and if it's helpful, I will give you some more clarity to kind of where this question is coming from for me. So at our last meeting, one of the things that actually in response to what you raised, Representative Wattenberg, was, does it make sense for us to go to some other meetings and share that like we're having this conversation and gather feedback around? And so actually, and I think my response was, I think of this as and both. I think it's important for us to open up spaces that are public, and it's not like you already have to be going to a meeting or already have a group. For people like that to have access to, and I value people who are already tapped in to certain groups. And so I don't think of it necessarily as a different set of information that we are trying to identify. I do think of it as a different way to engage. And so what I heard Representative Gasoy say was it would be helpful, and I will agree with this, is that it would be helpful to have an abridged version as a way to engage with people at existing meetings. And I guess I'm curious if they're like, I heard a Representative Gasoy say Kindred was one place that might make sense to go where you can get valuable feedback. But that's where I'm coming from. It's like, I see these governance committee meetings as iterative. And so I do my best to look back and say, all right, what was the work we said we were going to do? Where do we say we needed to go next? And so that's where this question is coming from. Is that helpful?
Sort of. I mean, yes. And are we trying to create I mean, it does just sort of go back. And then are we trying to create recommendations or using this on our own? And I don't expect it to get answered, but it continues to be in my mind.
What do you mean using this on our own? Because I think that personally, I have been involved in this issue. Personally, I have offered, I have made public comments and critiques about the existing system. I will continue to do so. I intend to testify when when the hearing comes up. And I want to be helpful to, and I think it would be great for the board to engage as well. I guess I'm trying to I don't know. I'm just.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I will say, I think of this committee's work with my representative hats. Like, I think of this as not, and I think of this as part, like literally when I say like representative is our title and our job description, my assumption is as part of that, we are always learning and always gathering feedback.
Totally.
I definitely am someone who has opinions. I have strong opinions about most things. I have strong opinions about big things, little things, all the things, right? That is my default. That is my personality. I also am someone who has been pretty engaged, and before coming to the board, has done advocacy around things. That being said, I see the work of this committee at this point as defined by what's needed in our work plan to come up with a recommendation that is representative of a larger base, like not just the people who I think agree with me or I most naturally am happy to work with, not just the people who I already know. I think our responsibility is to create opportunities to engage more broadly. I would say one of the things that I personally have been dissatisfied with as a citizen is just the way our elected officials go about engagement. I think that for me, I can both understand and appreciate people having experiences and continue and like agendas and continue, and I get that. And I will never say to someone they can't do those things because of course you can. But I think for the purposes of this committee's work, these engagements are designed to, again, kind of put everyone on equal footing so they go into our recommendation. Like that doesn't stop you from testifying and say like, here's how I feel about the thing, right? But that's not how we're designing these engagements. And of course, as you have those engagements, they'll probably inform your, can I use this as an individual thing? I don't know if I took that in a different direction, because I know there was a question around like just being, eloquent or clear, but like that's my response.
Oh, did you lose your sound? Looks like Ruth maybe lost her.
All right, I'm back. Sorry, I missed part of that, but not all of it. So I guess partly you answered it, which is that the goal is to come up with broad recommendations from the board. That's based on this broad feedback. That does help me a lot. I guess part of what I'm trying to say is, and I want to be clear on this too. Yeah, I have points of view. That's not, my point isn't that, oh, I have a point of view and I'm going to bring it to you. My point is I've been in this position for 7 years. I've gotten a lot of feedback. It's not that I right? So I don't think I can bring to you feedback that is absent everything previous. I guess there's sort of a, insofar as I'm bringing you what it's not just me, it's a lot of people over a number of years. But I'm also happy to be part of something that tries to, but if the goal is to get recommendations, I get, I mean, that makes sense. I get that. So that helps me.
Yeah, that's fair. That's totally fair.
And I guess all I'm saying, and that to understand that, and that we want to all get, in the end, we have equal footing in the sense that we all have one vote and we all have 3 minutes, whatever it is. What we represent in terms of when we say that is going to be who we know and have talked to with our responsibility of reaching out as broadly as possible. I'm just saying, if you've been here for a number of years, it doesn't start yesterday. I get, that's sort of all I want to say. I think I've made it about 11 times now, and I'm sorry it's been fuzzy and hard, but
No worries. I mean, that makes sense. What is it saying? Like we might have been born at night, but not last night. So yes, the expectation is
I didn't know that one. That's a good
right.
one.
Like that's the thing. And so I get that. I think when I talk about equal footing, it is just the public engagement, right? It is the people who are showing up, not necessarily that we ourselves are blank slates. It is about creating space for other people. And so I hope that's helpful. We're at 2, but I think we've had a productive hour of conversation. I'm going to reiterate that I'm going to invite us to, give some more feedback via email. Yeah, and I know we'll follow up with what John Paul will follow up, trying to wrangle all of Corolla's cats around the fall dates.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for the questions. I think that was really helpful to be able to work with those. It gave something to, think about ahead of
Push them
time.
up some more, because they are far from perfect. They're super.
Oh yeah, but I mean, just even having, yes, they are. No, I'm just kidding. But I'm just saying, like, having that to start with, it was generative, it was good. So, all right, gotta jump. Thank you. Have a great weekend, everybody, and see you soon. Bye, John Paul.
Bye. Ruth, were you trying to say something? I saw you kind of, and then I didn't know. Did you hear me? Okay, well, we'll go. Bye.